It's been a long time since I covered a council estate, but this is one that really caught my eye. Today, I'm on the Whittington estate. And it's raining. The Whittington estate is in Highgate, North London, part of the borough of Camden. It was completed in 1979, and as such I feel like it's an obvious follow-up to my other videos on the subject of council estates. See, a running theme in the estates and buildings I've looked at so far is the fact that council estates and planned communities often tend to be quite unnatural. By which I mean, old towns tend to grow organically over a period of decades or centuries. With that comes community. People get to know each other, they have a lot in common. Things like shops and local facilities arise according to needs. These communities are very hard to recreate artificially, but that never seems to stop architects from trying. There was Robin Hood Gardens, an attempt to create what its designers referred to as streets in the sky. There were the Trellick and Balfron Towers, built with the socialist politics of their architect in mind. And there was Thamesmead, an attempt to create an entire new town from scratch. All failed in one way or another. I've read lots of interesting thoughts on why this happened, ranging from journal articles to comments on this very channel. Poor design, poor maintenance, the fact that councils used estates as a dumping ground for problem tenants, the fact that residents felt no sense of attachment or ownership, architects with ivory tower ideals. I think these are all contributing factors. The Whittington estate was planned in the 1960s, before many of the faults of the aforementioned examples had made themselves known. And would you believe me if I said it was a student project? It was designed by the Hungarian-born architect Peter Tabori. Tabori studied at Regent Street Polytechnic under Erno Goldfinger, the man behind the Trellick and Balfron Towers, and Dennis Lasdon, the man behind the brutalist developments around Waterloo on the south bank of the Thames. Tabori needed a diploma project and wrote to nearby Camden Council to ask if they had any projects he could produce a design for. As it happened, they did. Highgate these days is quite an upmarket part of town, but back in the 60s, not so much. In the area around Highgate Hill, 3/4 of houses didn't even have a bathroom. So, in 1966, the council began working on a massive redevelopment. This was to be known as Highgate New Town. Tabori set to work on his own scheme. The site is on a hill, quite a steep one in fact, and sits next to Highgate Cemetery. He came up with a design that's often compared to a ziggurat, a series of stepped levels. The flats themselves were also built in a stepped form. Tabori took influence from a number of sources. The blocks were to be built in the brutalist style from concrete slabs, which was inspired by the work of Atelier 5, a Swiss firm of architects that I guess I should actually call Atelier 5. That's your actual French. Like all architects' firms, Atelier 5 can't just straight up say what they're about, but as far as I could tell, something about being practical and community needs and challenging the limits of something. Point is, if architects in the 60s loved concrete so much, they should have just married it. But Tabori also drew on the work of Neve Brown, an American-born architect who, in fact, worked for Camden. Brown's philosophy was that, for all the flaws of the 19th century housing the council was looking to replace, it had aspects that were very desirable. Residents weren't isolated from their environment and community. They had their own front door and their own open space, even if it wasn't much. The space should be practical, but also flexible to the needs of the resident. To be honest, it's hard to tell the difference between a Neve Brown block and the work of Tabori. The Whittington estate, therefore, was designed as brutalism with a human face. Have I used that metaphor before? Well, I like it, so I'll use it again. It incorporated many of the ideas regarding materials and shapes that were in style among architects at the time, but it used them differently. There would be no imposing, intimidating tower blocks. This would be high-density housing, yes, but low-rise. Well, kind of. The blocks were actually up to 4 stories high, but the use of a steep slope and stepped buildings meant that this wasn't obvious. Greenery was integral to the build, and really it's a shame I filmed in late November. Each row of houses would have different vegetation planted to create an individual character. There would be recreation areas throughout. Vehicles and utilities would be kept separate from the housing. Entrance to each flat or maisonette would be via walkways and bridges directly from street level. Residents could go outside and be in the community right away, unlike the isolated corridors created by tower blocks. While externally the houses look identical, they in fact come in a variety of sizes from 1 to 3 bedrooms. Each one would have a south-facing courtyard and broad windows to let natural light in. Kitchens would look out onto the street to enable supervision of children playing outside. After graduation, Tabori went to work for Camden Council under borough architect Sidney Cook. Cook was aware of Tabori's design for Highgate and asked him to make it a reality. And so he did. Interiors were designed by Ken Adey and included sliding partitions to make the space more flexible. It all sounds rather utopian, but things weren't to pan out quite as planned. Construction began in 1972 with the intent of completion in 1974. But the use of precast concrete caused problems. The panels proved defective. The original contractors went bust and the houses already built had to be demolished and rebuilt. As the cost rose, original features, such as the large windows for natural light, were removed from the design. The project wasn't completed until 1979, having come in at over twice its projected price. Plans to extend the design concept to other new developments were shelved. The concept of keeping housing and cars separate created its own problems. Vehicles were stored in an underground car park. This was supposed to be guarded by an attendant, but with money being tight, none was provided. Oddly enough, some residents complained that the separation from their cars meant that they couldn't show their vehicles off. You know it's Thatcher's Britain when that's what bothers you. But brutalist design tends to bring a common set of problems, and the Whittington estate couldn't avoid them. The underground car park became quite leaky and prone to flooding. And there was the crime thing. Anyone could get onto the estate, and once there were plenty of nooks and crannies where an antisocial soul might hide out. There were reports of used syringes in the alleys between buildings and cars in the car park being set alight. But I have to admit that I haven't found much by way of specifics. I've seen an equal, or perhaps greater number of residents praising the estate for its feel of community, and what criticism there is tends to be levelled at the council for underinvestment in maintenance. The blog Municipal Dreams, which was a very useful source for this video, suggests that perhaps the press were exaggerating the dangers for the sake of a good story. So, does that make the Whittington a success, relatively speaking? Well, it's hard to say. By the time the estate was complete, tastes were changing. Evolution of social housing would bring things full circle. Architects started out trying to be radical and different, and discovered that didn't work. What did work was trying to replicate the way things had been done before the council estates came along. Which raises the obvious question. Why build new houses that imitate the old ones when you've already got the old ones? Emphasis shifted on to renovating and reworking the characterful older houses. Meanwhile, the 1980 right-to-buy legislation encouraged council tenants to buy their flats, which many did. The value of the flats skyrocketed, and now a one-bed flat goes for around £450,000. Something in the region of a third of the residences on the estate are now privately owned, so it's basically impossible to say whether the estate works as council housing, because so much of it isn't. This is another of those ironies that we see play out a lot with these social housing projects, that once they're made to actually work, all too often they cease to be social, or even affordable. But still, the Whittington has its fans. The low-rise design and emphasis on greenery means that it blends into its surroundings a lot better than, say, the enormous Robin Hood gardens. As a result, it feels like part of Highgate instead of a separate unit where people are isolated from the rest of the city. Among architecture enthusiasts, it's considered part of Camden Council's golden age of social housing. I feel like there are a lot of what-ifs that would be interesting to play out. What if the project had been completed in 1974 at a time when it could have been compared directly to the likes of Robin Hood Gardens and Thamesmead? What if right-to-buy legislation hadn't been enacted? What if Tabori hadn't been restricted by money? Tabori has seen his architecture go from something new and radical to something perceived as retro, stylish and beloved. All in all, it makes me wish I'd worked a bit harder on my student projects. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I certainly enjoyed researching it. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the Whittington estate, particularly if you're personally familiar with it. When I did my videos on Thamesmead, Robin Hood Gardens and Erno Goldfinger's towers, I was able to find lots of information on what it was like for actual council tenants to live there. But there really doesn't seem to be much on the Whittington. Most of what there is more recent, and often geared towards selling you a flat there. Anyway, I hope to cover more of these famous estates, loved and unloved, in the future. If you liked this video, please do click the like button. You can even click dislike if you didn't like it. And don't forget to subscribe for more on London, its architecture, and anything else that takes my fancy. Thanks as ever to my generous donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the reinforcement to my concrete panels. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio!